A salesman stands in a hardware store parking lot in 1979. A small crowd of skeptical shoppers gathered around a mower they've never heard of. He grips the starter cord. He pulls. The engine catches on the first try. He lets it die, waits a beat, and pulls again. It catches again. He does it a third time, a fourth, a fifth, and it never once fails to start. Nobody in that crowd claps. A few of them just stand there doing the math on how many times their own mower has stranded them mid-yard with a flooded carburetor and a sore shoulder. This wasn't a stunt. It was the entire sales pitch. A machine that starts every time doesn't need one. That parking lot moment repeated itself in dealerships and store aisles across the country for years. And it's the reason a company nobody associated with lawn care ended up owning the reputation for the most dependable push mower in America. The company was Honda. Before 1978, they had never built a lawn mower in their history. What they had built for decades was small engines that could not afford to fail because failure, for Honda, had once meant something closer to survival than inconvenience. Every week on this channel, we tell the story behind the machines and the brands that built the working world, the founders, the factories, and the decisions that either made a name mean something or quietly hollowed it out. If that's the kind of story you're here for, go ahead and subscribe now, because this one starts in a country with no roads left to drive on. The real starting point isn't 1978. It's Japan right after World War II, when the country had almost no working infrastructure left. Roads were damaged. Fuel was rationed and hard to find. Trains and buses ran late or didn't run at all. Ordinary people had no reliable way to reach work, or a market, or a hospital. A young mechanic named Soichiro Honda watched this problem play out every day, and he wasn't trying to build a company yet. He was trying to solve the thing directly in front of him. He found a small stockpile of leftover military engines, the kind once used to power radio generators during the war. Most people would have called it scrap. Honda strapped these engines onto ordinary bicycles and turned basic bikes into small, motorized transport that didn't depend on a bus schedule that no longer existed. It wasn't a polished invention. It was a survival tool built out of necessity. But it taught Honda a lesson that would shape the company for the next 50 years. An engine's value has nothing to do with how it looks. Its value is whether it starts, whether it runs, and whether a person can depend on it when there's no backup plan. That lesson became the foundation for every category Honda entered afterward: motorcycles, cars, and eventually lawn mowers. That obsession with reliability is what pushed Honda into motorcycle racing, first in Japan and then overseas, against the best engine builders in the world. Racing wasn't about trophies. It was the harshest stress test available, forcing an engine to run flat out for hours without failing once. Every lesson learned on a racetrack fed straight back into the ordinary engines Honda sold to ordinary buyers. By the time the lawnmower assignment landed on an engineering team's desk in 1978, Honda had spent decades proving its engines under real pressure, which is exactly why a mower felt like such an odd fit to the racing specialists who got handed the project. By 1953, that approach had become a real product line. Honda's first general-purpose engine, a small two-stroke built for pumps and farm equipment. It sold well. A year later came a four-stroke follow-up, and that shift mattered more than it looked at the time. A two-stroke engine is simpler and cheaper to build. but it burns oil mixed directly into the gasoline, which means more smoke, more smell, and faster wear on every moving part. A four-stroke keeps the oil separate, burns cleaner, and holds up far longer under daily use. It also costs more and takes more precision to manufacture correctly. Honda chose the harder, pricier path anyway, betting that reliability mattered more to buyers than a lower sticker price. A real financial risk for a company still small enough that a wrong bet could have sunk it. This wasn't a symbolic gesture about quality. It reflected a specific view about how buyers actually made decisions not on sticker price alone, but on what a machine cost them over years of ownership, in fuel, in oil, in repairs, and in the frustration of a tool that quit working when they needed it most. That single choice separated Honda from nearly every company that would go on to dominate the American lawn equipment industry. In the United States, companies like Briggs and Stratton and Tecumseh had built their entire business model around selling small engines to dozens of different mower brands. Those engines were cheap, widely available, and functional, but functional was the goal, not durability. Cost per unit mattered more than how long the thing actually lasted. Two-stroke engines became the industry standard in American lawn equipment because they were lighter and cheaper to manufacture, even though they wore out faster and left behind the familiar smell of burnt oil hanging over every backyard in the country. Nobody making mowers in America was asking whether a four-stroke engine might be worth the extra cost. The industry had already settled on an answer, and Honda simply hadn't been in the room when that decision got made. So when Honda's first push mower arrived in the U.S. in 1979, it stepped straight into an industry built around cutting costs, not building machines meant to last. That first mower used a vertical four-stroke engine descended from the design Honda had been refining since the 1950s. It started easily. It ran quietly. It didn't leak oil the way the two-stroke machines around it did. None of that mattered much to a shopper walking into a hardware store that year. The shelves were lined with familiar, cheaper-looking machines, and nobody browsing them had any idea the engine inside worked differently, or that Honda even made mowers in the first place. They knew Honda motorcycles. A lawn mower from the same company wasn't on anyone's radar. Honda had a choice at that point. It could cut corners to compete on price, the way the rest of the lawn equipment industry operated, and there was a real short-term case for doing exactly that. American buyers in 1979 were price-sensitive. Gas prices were climbing, and a cheaper machine would have moved off the shelf faster in that first season. Instead, Honda made the same bet it had made with motorcycles years earlier. It competed on something much harder to fake, whether the machine would still run years later without constant repair. That's where the parking lot demonstrations came in, and where the doubt started to crack. It wasn't advertising. It was a salesperson pulling a cord in front of real people over and over, and the engine simply doing what it was supposed to do every single time. While competitors' mowers needed new spark plugs, carburetor cleanings, or replacement starter cords almost every season, the Honda kept running with almost no maintenance at all. Homeowners who bought one often came back years later, not because it had broken, but because they wanted a second one for another part of the yard. The first was still running fine. By 1985, worldwide sales of Honda's mower line had crossed 300,000 units, with roughly half sold in the United States. Growth that doesn't come from an ad budget. It comes from one satisfied buyer telling a neighbor, and that neighbor telling someone else. That reliability wasn't an accident, and it came from a decision most of the competition wasn't willing to make. Almost every other mower company in America bought its engines from outside suppliers and bolted them onto a mower deck they'd designed separately. That kept costs low, but it also meant those companies had no control over the one part of the machine most likely to fail. If the engine had a weakness, the Mower brand couldn't fix it. They hadn't built it. Honda controlled the entire process, engine to deck, and that control showed up in details a homeowner would actually notice. The company used overhead valve and overhead cam engine designs, more precise and more expensive to manufacture than the basic flathead engines most competitors relied on. In practice, that meant the engine burned fuel more efficiently, so a homeowner spent less at the gas station over a season, and it produced noticeably less exhaust smell drifting across the yard. Honda also built in a blade brake system that stopped the spinning blade almost instantly the moment someone let go of the handle, the kind of feature that mattered a great deal to a homeowner who got distracted mid-cut and let go to answer the phone. Nothing required Honda to add that yet. No regulation demanded it. They added it because it matched the same philosophy from the 1950s. Build the machine to protect the person depending on it, not just to clear the minimum bar the law happened to set. To back all of this up, Honda opened its own manufacturing plant in Swepsonville, North Carolina, in 1984, building engines and assembling machines close to the people who'd actually use them, instead of shipping finished mowers across an ocean. It meant faster repairs and gave dealers more confidence to stand behind the product. And mowers weren't Honda's only move into this space. Generators arrived in the U.S. in 1973, followed by tillers, small outboard boat motors, and water pumps a couple of years later. The mower wasn't a single gamble. It was one more piece of a growing lineup built on the same reliability first foundation, and a customer who already trusted a Honda generator during a power outage had every reason to trust a Honda mower in the backyard. Here's a detail almost nobody outside a small, oddly devoted online community knows. Those original late 1970s and early 1980s Honda push mowers now have a real collector following. Search around forums like My Lawnmower Forum or My Tractor Forum, and you'll find people trading serial numbers, comparing engine casting dates, and swapping stories about a machine that, by most standards, should have been landfill decades ago. One thread on the subject describes tracking down an early model as being like finding a unicorn. Someone else in that same community points out a small, strange engineering detail collectors love to argue about. An early version that ran the timing belt inside the oily crankcase. An unusual choice nobody else in the industry copied, for better or worse. Collectors aren't chasing these mowers for nostalgia alone. They're chasing a specific piece of engineering history. The first moment a company treated a lawn mower with the same seriousness it treated a racing engine built at a level of finish nobody expected from a machine meant to sit in a garage. It's a small, slightly obsessive corner of the internet, and it exists entirely because the machines Honda built in that era simply refused to die on schedule. Small engine repair shops became an unlikely source of proof for all of this. Mechanics who worked on dozens of brands every week noticed a pattern. Customers rarely brought in a Honda for anything more than a routine tune-up, while other brands came in constantly for cracked housings, seized engines, and starter cords that snapped after a single hard pull. A mechanic telling a customer honestly that their Honda probably didn't need the repair they'd come in for was giving away a sale, and it happened anyway, because the reputation held up under scrutiny. Word like that travels at least as far as any advertisement, and it travels for free. That reputation might have stayed a quiet corner of the lawn care market if nothing else had changed. But something did, and it worked entirely in Honda's favor, in a way nobody at the company could have planned for or timed on purpose. Regulators began paying much closer attention to small engine pollution, California leading the way, and federal regulators following, tightening emissions rules for mowers, generators, and other outdoor equipment. The two-stroke engines that had powered the cheap end of the lawn equipment industry for decades suddenly became a serious liability. They burned oil directly with the fuel, producing more pollution per hour of use than a car engine, and the exhaust smell drifting through backyards stopped being just an annoyance and became exactly the kind of thing regulators were trying to eliminate. For most manufacturers, this meant expensive redesigns, new tooling, and retrained production lines, all on a deadline, set by regulators rather than their own product roadmap. Honda barely had to pivot. It had already spent 30 years refining exactly the kind of engine regulators were now demanding from everyone else, which meant it walked into this new regulatory era with a head start nobody else had any realistic way to close quickly. That's the real answer behind this whole story. Honda didn't win the American lawnmower market by outspending anyone on advertising, and it didn't win with a clever marketing trick. It won because an engineering philosophy built for motorcycles, one that treated a simple mower engine with the same seriousness as a racing engine, turned out to match exactly what the entire industry would eventually be forced to demand from itself. For nearly 4 decades, Honda kept building its own mower engines at that same North Carolina plant, and the lineup grew to cover everything from budget-conscious homeowners to landscapers running a mower for hours a day, every day. By 2015, Honda had reached more than 40 million power equipment customers in the U.S., a number built through word of mouth and repeat purchases, not short-term hype. It would be inaccurate to tell this story as an unbroken streak of wins from day one. Honda's first mower wasn't a flawless launch. It was expensive next to the competition, and some early dealers who sold it found the bagger attachment fussy and the parts slow to arrive. A Honda power equipment dealer from that era has said plainly that the early hype wore off within a couple of years, once buyers realized just how much they were paying for a heavier, more complicated machine. The mower that earned the reputation this video is about wasn't the HR-21 sitting on a shelf in 1979. It was the version of that machine Honda kept refining for the next decade, generation after generation, until starts every time stopped being a demonstration in a parking lot and became something millions of people simply expected without thinking about it. Then, in 2023, facing tighter emissions regulations and a changing market, Honda ended production of its gas-powered push mowers at that same North Carolina plant, shifting the facility toward a new product line. That wasn't a failure. Honda kept supporting parts and service for existing owners and kept building its other power equipment products in the same building. But the gas push mower that had carried Honda's reputation for over 4 decades was no longer coming off that line. The engineers handed the mower assignment back in 1978, were racing specialists who understood horsepower and speed. Getting handed a push mower project must have felt like a demotion, a detour away from the machines that had made their reputation. What they couldn't have known yet was that the same standard that made their motorcycles trustworthy on dangerous roads would make their lawn mowers trustworthy in ordinary backyards for the next 40 years. The push mower project was never a step down for Honda. It applied the exact same engineering discipline to a quieter, far more overlooked part of American life. Most of the people who bought one never rode a Honda motorcycle and never watched a Honda race car. Most of them never heard about the post-war bicycle engines or the young mechanic in a broken country trying to solve the problem directly in front of him. They just pulled a cord on a cold morning after a machine had sat untouched all winter and felt it catch on the first try. The same thing that salesmen in the parking lot in 1979 kept proving over and over to anyone willing to stand there and watch him do it. That standard, built out of necessity in a country with no roads left to drive on, is why a motorcycle company ended up building one of the most reliable push mowers in American history. It's why the reputation held for 4 decades, and why it's still the first thing anyone who owned one brings up, even now that the line itself is gone. If you want more stories like this, machines nobody expected to matter, built by people who took them more seriously than they had to, subscribe to the channel. There's another every week